time, I promise. So all of this is previous discussion was really by way of background, because as I said when I began, as an anthropologist, of course, I'm interested in the theory of social ecology and the ideas, because I use those ideas to orient my actions. That's very important. That's why I find the utopian perspective so important, because if you don't have a vision, and here I'm not talking about a blueprint or something which we would impose on everybody all around the world, but for me, the highest, the most profound form of utopia is a set of principles. And they are those principles that I talked about earlier. Those are the principles that social ecology holds forth as a utopian vision. And it's something which can serve as a point of inspiration for us. And very importantly, as a way to check whether the little incremental steps, because that's the way, of course, we will begin our journey, is one step at a time. But we want to make sure that those steps are leading us in the right direction. So if we don't know where we want to go, how can we know if we're moving in the right direction, or if in fact maybe we're moving in the opposite direction? So that's very important for me. Then I also want to emphasize that my primary interest, though, is not with theory. It's with praxis. It's with how these ideas can be applied in the real world today, in the communities where we live. And I've spent, 40 years studying that and working with those ideas. And I want to talk to you about a couple of my experiences in light of that. The first thing I want to do is just tell you a little about where I live, the state of Vermont in the U.S. Has anyone ever visited Vermont? I'm not surprised. And Malin, yeah. It's a tiny little state. We have the smallest population in the U.S., 660,000 people. It's in the northeast, right below Canada. Where we live is about 2 hours from Montreal, Quebec. It's a very rural place, the most rural state in the United States, with rurality defined as population living in towns and cities of less than 5,000 people. In fact, our biggest city only has 40,000 in the whole state. And most people live in little towns with 1,500, 1,600 people. And the whole state of Vermont practices town meeting democracy. And our communities generally are poor. People traditionally were farmers, dairy farmers in Vermont. And then tourism became the major industry. Agriculture is the second. We're famous for our maple syrup. Has anyone ever had Vermont maple syrup? It's very good. I recommend it. Another commercial. At any rate, in these little towns, we face all of the same problems, really, that people face anywhere. While Vermont is not terribly polluted, we have factories that pollute. We had a single nuclear power plant in the state. We were dependent on oil-fired energy and coal plants to produce our electricity. There's very little in the way of public transportation infrastructure, since it's such a rural state and things are really spread out. It's very mountainous. We have very severe winters. And it's kind of a unique place in the U.S., in part because we have this tradition of direct democracy, which is still alive. But Vermont has also been a very progressive place. In fact, I think Vermont would like to be part of Scandinavia. We have our senator in the federal government is the only avowed socialist in the United States Senate. And we're trying to implement single-payer health care there, health care for all. And we've had the most progressive environmental legislation in the United States has come out of Vermont. We were the first state to legalize gay marriage. And really I think maybe at this point, the only state where gay marriage was voted in instead of mandated by the court. So there's a progressive tradition there, and there's a tradition also of mutual aid and self-help in the little farming communities, the little hill farms. People had to cooperate in order to survive. And at the same time, there's also a very strong sense of individuality and respect for individuals and respect for diversity, for people's privacy and people's right to think what they want and do what they want, as long as it doesn't adversely affect others. So all of these things have combined to create kind of a unique environment. But At the same time, we faced problems. Even though we were an agricultural state, 90% of our food came from out of state. And most of our energy came either from Hydro-Quebec in Canada or over from New York State. So people in Vermont began looking, and in some cases consciously, examining things in the framework of social ecology. In other cases, people came to these ideas from other perspectives or out of their own experience. But we began a process of transforming Vermont and creating communities there which can be more self-reliant and more inclusive and more democratic. And that's taken a variety of forms. One of the things that has been a tremendous focus has been transformation of the Vermont energy system. And here we were able to utilize our town meetings in order to call for the closure of our single nuclear power station. And after about a 20-year battle, finally last year we succeeded. And they are closing this December, and we will no longer have nuclear power in Vermont. But that left us with a problem. How do we replace that? So we began, even though Vermont has a climate kind of like Scandinavia, though more severe, probably more cloudy days, colder winters, more snow, we began looking at alternative sources of energy. And we made a commitment statewide to create a Vermont renewable energy bank, which would allow us to be 100% renewable by 2030, 2050. And we've been moving on that path. And one of the vehicles that we've used to do that are town energy committees. And I sit on my town energy committee. And these are volunteer boards made up of citizens. Some are official committees of the town, others are simply unofficial and advisory. But on the energy, it's an energy and climate change committee. We started looking at what we could do locally to address the energy needs and energy conservation in our town. And we've done a number of things over the years, and these are not revolutionary things, they're not, huge things, but they add up and they've made a difference. So that, for example, we brought bus service to our town. We hadn't had any public transportation since they closed the railroads in the 1950s. Now we have a bus that runs down a corridor that takes people to and from work in the state capital, which is our nearest big town. It's one thing that we've done. We've also gone into the town, and the committee has offered energy audits so that we go into people's homes, and most of people in my town live in either old drafty farmhouses, 200-year-old houses, or little trailers, mobile homes. It's a poor community. So we've gone in and we've looked at what we can do to make people's homes more energy efficient, both to save energy and cut down on pollution and to save people money. We've held lots of educational events about climate change. We've brought in speakers, we've shown films, all of that. We have gone to the town and we've actually retrofit all of the town buildings, the municipal buildings, to make them more energy efficient. And then we outfitted the town buildings with solar collectors so that they now produce their own electricity. We've replaced all of the street lamps with LEDs to save energy there. We've tried to introduce solar into our local school system, and now we're on the verge actually of having a solar photovoltaic electric system to provide the electricity for our school. And we've also promoted, helped individuals install solar arrays at their homes. And we are in the process now of trying to create a town energy cooperative, which will utilize solar energy off-site to provide energy for anyone who wants to be a part of that co-op. So these are all small steps that we've taken at the community level. And we've been successful because it's at a human scale, because we know our neighbors, because we can go to the person who lives in the drafty old trailer and say, would you like some help? And Vermonters are very proud people. They don't want a handout. They want to do for themselves. They're very self-reliant. But if it's a neighbor helping a neighbor, they're very likely to say, sure, I appreciate it, I like it. And at the same time, we've used the town meeting to pass resolutions about nuclear power, calling for the closure of the nuclear power plant. We've passed resolutions, and this is not just in my town, but in 100 towns around Vermont. We passed resolutions calling for banning genetically modified organisms in Vermont, GMOs. We have passed resolutions that call for, there's a pipeline that runs through northern Vermont that they want to reverse the flow and use for tar sands from Alberta, terribly corrosive, horrible source of energy. And in fact, it's been suggested that if they actually succeed in extracting all of the tar sand oil, that's it for the climate. It's that bad. So we've passed resolutions about that. We passed also resolutions on the national level calling for a nuclear freeze. Town meetings in Vermont did that back in the year 2000. It resulted in a nationwide movement that led to a march of 1 million people in New York City. So we use the town meeting, the purview, the authority of the town meeting to make actual decisions is only decisions that affect the town. But we've also been able to use the town meeting to impact decisions on the state level and on the national level. Another important area where we've worked, and my wife has done a lot of work in this, she's with us, my darling wife today, on creating food security in Vermont, encouraging local agriculture. They've created farm-to-plate initiatives, putting farmers directly in contact with consumers, created community-supported agriculture systems, which take the risk out of farming. We've created farm-to-school programs so that instead of eating pizza and hamburgers and greasy French fries for school lunch, the kids now get wholesome food locally grown and raised, often organically. We've promoted a whole network of farmers markets in Vermont also, and we've slowly begun to create the basis for food security so that we won't be so dependent on those national and international sources of food, which, by the way, are extremely vulnerable, you know? I mean, as we know, when you monocrop, when industrial agriculture takes over, they grow one variety of corn, one variety of soybean, one variety of tomato, and at that point, if a pest comes in and wipes out that crop, food shortages. Or if the cost of oil keeps going up, transporting that food thousands of miles also makes you very vulnerable. So we're trying to create food security in the state. And all of this taken together constitutes a form of community development, which I see reflecting many of the principles that we've been talking about here tonight. And I've seen it work. It's not impossible to do. Vermont is a particular case. We have our own history and traditions, but I would suggest to you that almost any community has a history and a set of traditions that emphasize cooperative, mutualistic forms of behavior and cooperative and mutualistic economics. And what we've tried to do is recognize that in Vermont, at least today, they're much more limited than they were historically, but those traditions still resonate with people. And we've tried to resurrect them and revitalize them and expand their purview. And we've had some success doing it. I'm not suggesting that Vermont is ecotopia. It's not. We still have tremendous problems. But we're moving in the right direction, in my view. And very important. So, you know, you're living here in Gothenburg. This is a city of, what, 500,000 people? Something like that? Yeah. I'm talking about a state that has only 130,000 more than 500,000 people. So how could these ideas possibly be applied in a city? You know, maybe that really is utopian. No, it's not. And I'm going to show you some examples now. If I can get this to work. This is a challenge for me, but we'll try. Okay. How do I get it big now? Sorry. This is not my forte. Oh, yeah. That's
Right, that
doesn't hit that. Yeah. Okay.
and then you can use the arrow.
Yeah. I want to talk to you about a very special place in New York City. It's a neighborhood called Lower East Side. That's the Hispanic version of the name. It's the Lower East Side of Manhattan, the island of Manhattan. Who's been to New York here? Anyone? Have you ever been to the Lower East Side? No? Okay. Well, we're going to take a little journey to the Lower East Side. But this is the Lower East Side circa 1974. Lower East Side is the name given to a 30-square block part of the Lower East Side. Lower East Side is the historic portal of immigration to New York City. 40 million immigrants over 150 years have come through this particular neighborhood. The Irish came fleeing the potato famine. Western European immigrants came after the failed revolutions of 1848. Germans, Austrians, Southern Italians came in large numbers in the 1880s. Eastern European Jews came. Chinese people came. And the Lower East Side actually is made up of a series of different neighborhoods. Chinatown is a Lower East Side neighborhood. Little Italy is a Lower East Side neighborhood. And the most recent immigrants are Hispanic. They're from Puerto Rico, primarily Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. And at this time, Lower East Side was their home, one of their homes. About 80% Hispanic. And it was the poorest neighborhood in Manhattan. It had been redlined by the banks, which means they drew a red line around the neighborhood and said, we won't lend any money here. The city had pretty much written the neighborhood off, stopped collecting garbage, let them live in a mess. It's a ghetto. And as a ghetto, it has the traditional ills. This was a typical street scene. By 1974, 40% of all of the property in this neighborhood, Lower East Side, was abandoned. And it consisted of either vacant lots filled with garbage and rubble, like you see in the foreground, or burnt out buildings, like you see in the background, 5- and 6-story tenement houses. It was a mess. And it had all of the typical ills that one associates with the ghetto. Oh, no, I don't want to do that.
Use this arrow.
Right. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm really bad at this. This is a typical interior shot of an abandoned building. And here the pattern of abandonment went like this. Landlords who lived out of the neighborhood and owned the tenement buildings would milk rents. They'd raise rents, often illegally, and get as much money out of the tenants as they could. And at the same time, they'd stop delivering services so that if a window broke, they left it broke. If the boiler broke, well, let them use their kitchen stoves to stay warm in the winter. We don't care. So they wouldn't put any money into the buildings. And at the same time, they stopped paying taxes to the city of New York. And the city takes 3 years of non-payment of taxes before they come seize the building. So right before the city would come seize the building, they'd send in an arsonist to burn out the building so they could collect the fire insurance. And then let the city have it because it's worthless. So this was a neighborhood that's street gangs. This is a motorcycle gang, actually not typical. Mostly it was street gangs. A neighborhood that had tremendous problems. And as I mentioned earlier, a number of groups arose to address those problems. And they were very small scale. They were tenants associations, people who lived in a building, or block associations. There were groups that were working that created storefront clinics because healthcare is a big problem in this neighborhood too. People who created a food co-op because there were no supermarkets where people could buy food in this neighborhood. It was a food desert, in fact. Terrible problems with overcrowding and housing shortages. You'd have, 2-3 families sharing an apartment together because there wasn't housing. And yet people looked around, they took an ecological approach holistically. They looked at their neighborhood. They said, we have a lot of problems here, but we also have a lot of resources, potentially at least. These vacant lots, they could be cleaned out. They could be turned into vest pocket parks, or we could have gardens there and we could grow food. The empty buildings, they could be cleaned out and they could be transformed into decent housing for people. But they didn't have any money to do any of this because it's a very poor neighborhood, high rates of unemployment and underemployment, something like 30% youth unemployment in this neighborhood at that point. People had no money. And typically, when you begin a project like rehabbing a house, an apartment house, you have equity, you have cash that you put down, and then you can get a bank loan after you put down 10% or 20%. These people had no equity. So they created something they called sweat equity urban homesteading. And they went into the abandoned buildings, initially as squatters, and the city fought with them. The Housing and Development programs has its own police force, and they board up the buildings and padlock the doors, and people would come clip the padlocks and break into the buildings, and the next day the cops would come and evict them, and then they'd do it again the next day and the cops would come and evict them. And then the third or fourth time the cops came to evict them, there were 300 people in the street saying no, protesting. And the cops backed off. Why not? What can they do with these burned out buildings? They're worthless anyway. Let them have them. That was the attitude. So lacking money, people said, how are we going to fix up these buildings? You saw the interior. It took, in many cases, it took like 6 months or a year just to clean the building out. But people started doing that work themselves, and they said, we don't have money, but we have time and we have labor. So our labor, our sweat, will be our equity. Thus, sweat equity, urban homesteading. And they used the same process to go into the vacant lots. This was the first sweat equity building, 519 East 11th Street. And you see here, this was still the clean out stage, I believe. And this on the right is 519 East 11th Street 4 years later. And it's twins, still abandoned on the other side. So these were small groups of community activists initially, but other people looked around and saw what they were doing and became interested in the process, so that ultimately a lot of people took over buildings and began this sweat equity process. They were also able to use political pressure, both direct action, taking over the buildings, protest politics, marching on City Hall with demands, and utilizing the existing political system. There were some sympathetic people in the housing office and some sympathetic people in the mayor's office. And they were able to elect people who represented them. And ultimately were able to gain legal title to the buildings for minimal sums. Building would sell for $100 a unit or $1,500 for a building because the city thought they were worthless anyway. And it turned out that using their own sweat, and these were mostly unskilled people when they began. Then they looked around the neighborhood. One of the groups I worked closely with was called Charas, and their motto was doing more with less. A very ecological concept, by the way. And they had a very ecological understanding. In fact, they were quite brilliant in their understanding of the neighborhood and the relationship between real estate, between housing and open space and healthcare and education and economics. And they even brought in arts and culture. And they brought in, to a certain degree, spirituality as well. And they drew on the traditions of cooperation that they brought with them from Puerto Rico. They had hometown clubs, they had mutual aid societies. There was always an informal economy where people would make loans to each other or help each other with child care or do whatever they could to help sustain themselves. So they were very conscious and aware of that, and they drew on those elements to create a holistic process of community development, which tried to put all of these pieces together. Ultimately, there were over 100 community organizations that grew up in this 30 square block area, ranging from block associations to storefront clinics, to educational activists, to radical artists, collectives. And they began to meet together. And they created a quarterly town meeting where they came together 4 times a year. And not all 30,000 people attended the town meetings. About half of the people in this neighborhood, in fact, were involved with drugs. They were either addicts or dealers or somehow affected by drugs, and they didn't have much interest at this point in this process. There were a lot of kids also, but we would get 500 people attending these meetings, and some of them came as individuals, but others came representing these community organizations. It created a very powerful counterforce to the city political structure using these town meetings. In fact, the city had an official planning agency of community boards, but they were undemocratic. They were appointed by the political leaders of the city. And they drew up plans for this neighborhood, and they had big plans because it's only a 20-minute walk from Wall Street, Lower East Side. So they wanted to turn it into a place where the stockbrokers could live and the yuppies could come and be happy. And people said, no, this is our town. We named it. It's Lower East Side. It's not the Lower East Side. This is where we live. And we're not going anywhere. And in fact, we have a very different vision for our community. So they created something called the Lower East Side Joint Planning Council, and they actively opposed the official plans of the city, and they went at it hard and fast. Once again, people used direct action, protest, and politics in that battle, and ultimately they won. Ultimately, at one point they won. It's a more involved story than that. It's one of the projects I worked on. We created the first recycling center in Manhattan. It was an old abandoned oil company garage. This was back in the 70s, and we were just collecting bottles and cans and papers. And one of the big problems in this neighborhood was that, in fact, there was a lot of garbage on the street because the city services were not adequate. So they let the garbage sit there, and the rats would chew open the garbage bags, vermin. The vacant lots were, covered with 4 or 5 feet of garbage, and kids would be playing in them and get bitten by rats. Terrible situation. So Chara said, we're starting this recycling center, and now we're going to pay 2 cents for cans and bottles, and we'll accept your paper. And all of a sudden, for blocks around the recycling center, you couldn't find a bottle or a can because the local kids went out and picked them up and brought them in. So they got a little change in their genes. We cleaned up the neighborhood, created a center that people felt proud of. This is just an interior shot, and provided a couple of jobs, by the way, for people who were able to work in the recycling center. So this is a kind of holistic approach to community development that we talk about in social ecology. Identifying problems, finding ways to solve them that benefit both the environment and the people who live in the community. This was a big vacant lot that was cleaned out and turned into a cultural plaza. And as I mentioned earlier, people utilized the arts as well. This is a mural. There was a group called City Arts that went around the neighborhood painting these murals on the sides of abandoned buildings. And this mural speaks to the multicultural heritage of the Lower East Side, and it was a point of pride for people, something that they could relate to. And the Cultural Plaza then served as a place where people would come to play music, where people would perform plays, where poets would come recite poetry. And culture and the arts played a very important role in this community development process. By the way, you can see the abandoned buildings in the background here along Avenue C. And as I said, about 40% of the property in the neighborhood was in that condition back in the 70s. El Sol Brillante Community Garden. This was another vacant lot that we cleaned out. And actually, when we tested the soil, because we wanted to grow vegetables there, this was the first organic garden in New York City on the Lower East Side in 1975. And it was also established as a community land trust to take it off of the real estate market, so it can't ever be used for anything except a community garden. It's a covenant written into the deed of the property. And in this process, it was interesting because people said, you're going to have a garden? This is the Lower East Side. Forget it. The gangs are going to come destroy it, or somebody's going to come do something horrible, and it's not going to work. But in fact, it turned out that a lot of the residents, a lot of the Puerto Rican people in this neighborhood came from the Puerto Rican countryside. They were jibaros, Puerto Rican hillbillies. They didn't come from San Juan, from the urban areas. And they had a lot of experience growing things, a lot of experience with gardens. And they were thrilled to have the opportunity to grow something. So they took plots in these gardens. And then, of course, it's also a poor neighborhood, so a lot of life, at least in the summer, is lived out of doors. People sit on the stoops and play dominoes. The kids play under the fire hydrants in the street. And they kept an eye on the garden, and if anybody approached that garden with ill intent, a grandmother would come screaming at them from across the street. A little kid would start throwing pebbles at them. So it worked. It worked, and people were thrilled with it. So another example, and this is very basic. I mean, they weren't growing a huge amount of food. But once again, the idea is that you begin by taking small steps, and they wanted to have a greater degree of food security in their neighborhood. And this, along with creating the food co-op, enabled them to gain a degree of control. And these community gardens and vest pocket parks spread throughout the community like wildfire. Every block had a garden or a park, or a garden and a park and a playground, depending on how many vacant lots there were. And at the community meetings, they actually developed a master plan for this whole 30 blocks. And this is where they began first by looking at the resources that existed in the neighborhood, so that the unskilled workers doing the sweat equity looked around and said, hey, we have some union workers here who actually know carpentry and bricklaying and electricity and plumbing. Maybe they'd teach us how to do it. And they did. And then they created a tool bank so that not every building had to buy all of its own tools to do the work, so they could share resources. And then they also looked farther out. They started with the resources in the community, a very ecological approach, and then they expanded out as needed. So that was where we got involved. They actually, since the Institute was doing early work with alternative technology and organic food production, they asked if we could provide some technical assistance and some planning assistance. So we came in and we started working with them. But it was always the community that controlled things. We were not the outside experts coming in saying, you do this, this, and this. They said, this is what we want to do. Please help us do it. And we were able to. So, as I said, community gardens spread throughout the neighborhood. Young and old, lots of people involved. School programs came to use the gardens to teach the kids about how to grow food. This was another project we worked on. This was a youth-run youth center. This was a huge building that had been abandoned by a church. It had been a settlement house. And it had been a real center for the community, and they walked away from it. So a group called Cuando took it over. Cuando means when in Spanish, and it's also the acronym for Cultural Understanding and Neighborhood Development Organization. They had 2 gymnasiums in here, but they had no heat. So they were useless in the winter. So we helped them build a trombe wall, a passive solar heat wall that heated one of the gyms so they could run programs there during the summer. And this is a youth group. The oldest guy in this group was 18 years old, and they took over this huge building. The first time they took me through it, that we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and we're going to, and I don't think so. But they proved me wrong. They were very dynamic, very incredible group of young people. Another group, Charas, built geodesic domes. They were actually taught to do this by Buckminster Fuller, the inventor of the geodesic dome back in the 60s. They used them for temporary housing, for play structures and playgrounds, greenhouses. Cuando began manufacturing these window box greenhouses. And the sweat equity building that had solar collectors on the roof became they started a solar installation collective, and another building started a carpentry collective. So there was an economic development aspect to this community development effort as well, providing some jobs and skills training and education for people as we went along. And I'll wrap this up very soon so we can have more questions. As I mentioned, the arts played a very important role. This is the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. They developed their own school of poetry, New Eurekan Poetry, which has become famous around the world. I don't know if anyone know what a poetry slam is. This is where they started. They invented the poetry slam at the New Eurekan Poets Cafe. And it turns out that as things developed, a new spirit grew in the neighborhood, a new sense of community, connections between people. Soon, every summer, each week, a different block would hold a block festival, and they'd block off the street, bring in a salsa band. This is Machito and his orchestra. Actually a big name salsa band, very famous. A lot of the musicians lived in the neighborhood, so they volunteered. They'd come play. Street festivals, etc. This is Chino Garcia. He was the chairman of Charas. He's one of the people I mentioned earlier who began his career as a gang leader and then became a real force for good in his community. And still is today, dear friend of mine. Chino's still going strong. Standing in front of a huge abandoned school. The city had abandoned a school building. Charas, we went into the school building initially as squatters, took it over, and started running programs there. There was an art gallery, a theater program, poetry readings, folkloric dancing, after-school tutoring, provided office space for all of the other community organizations. It was a fantastic center, and it was very open and welcoming, and it invited everyone. And even though this is primarily a Puerto Rican and Dominican community, anyone was welcome at these events. They had a very inclusive spirit, and it was remarkable, truly remarkable. And what they achieved was fantastic. This slide shows a windmill on top of 519 East 11th Street, and somehow we missed the slide of the solar collectors, but you can see them in the background there. This was the first application of solar energy in New York City. And we put it on a tenement building that grew out of the sweat equity urban homesteading process, because for once, instead of being at the bottom of the heap, people wanted to be on the cutting edge. And it produced hot water for the building. And another thing that we did was put up a windmill. First use of wind power in New York City. Just a little 1,800 watt windmill. It produced enough electricity to run the lights in the hallway. But it was also a very important symbol for the neighborhood. And speaking of symbols, in the background you see smokestacks. That's a Con Edison generating facility. Con Edison is the utility that provides electricity for New York City. And they've been a horrible presence in this neighborhood, the smokestacks belching smoke and polluting the neighborhood, blocks taken up by relay stations. And, you know, if you don't pay your bill in the middle of winter, they come cut off your power and let you freeze. They didn't care. So anyway, we put the windmill up and fed it using a Gemini inverter, fed it back into the grid and turned the meter backwards to receive credit for the electricity we were generating. And Con Edison said, "You're going to blow out the grid. You can't do that. We're not going to let you do it." We said, "What do you mean you're not going to let us do it?" Took them to court. And actually 519 East 11th Street versus Con Edison, which was decided in the favor of 519 East 11th Street, set the precedent for the independent power industry, which is now a multi-billion-dollar industry in the United States. That was the legal precedent. So that's why people can now put up solar collectors, feed the power back into the grid, and receive payment for it. So anyway, this is Lower East Side. And I wish I could tell you that if you went to New York today, you could go to Lower East Side and you would see Ecotopia. But in fact, one of the great ironies is that the very success of the movement, as the movement gained power, as the movement began to transform the neighborhood block by block, it became a very attractive place. And all of a sudden, white people wanted to live there. First students and artists, and then later the yuppies and the stockbrokers wanted to live in the neighborhood. So by 1980, this movement had become so successful that there was tremendous pressure, and the people who had abandoned their buildings were now saying, "I'll pay the back taxes, I want the building back." And unfortunately, New York got a horrible mayor named Rudy Giuliani, who declared when he was elected, "The era of socialism on the Lower East Side is over. We're not giving away any more buildings or vacant lots. They're all going to auction sales to the highest bidder." And we saw real estate speculators move in. I saw a building sell for $12,000, then 6 months later sell for $30,000, and 6 months after that sell for $300,000. And the real estate became valuable. The landlords started pushing out the low-income tenants so they could bring in wealthy people. The clubs and boutiques and fancy restaurants started moving into the neighborhood. And despite people's best efforts to fight this gentrification process, if you go to the Lower East Side today, you'll see very little of what I talked about left. Giuliani tried to take the existing community gardens away. They were able to hold on to some of them. But no more auction sales. The buildings that had successfully completed sweat equity urban homesteading renovations and organized as low-income tenants cooperatives are still there, but they're spotted in the midst of what is today an affluent neighborhood. So there are some lessons to be learned from that as well, and we made some mistakes, obviously. Nonetheless, this experience, and granted this is ancient history today, I'm talking about something we did back in the 70s, but for me it was a very instructive process. I learned a lot from it, and I think it offers lessons for all of us. And to my mind, it's one of the best examples of how those principles that I talked about earlier can be applied in a real-world process, community development, and can move us towards the kind of society that we need to create if we're going to avert disaster. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Comments?
I have a question, which is a little bit like, for me it feels like there's, sometimes it's easier to do stuff when when everything is in the bottom. I feel like here they're so busy, they don't have any time, and we kind of have to deconstruct ourselves, and that is a very difficult process. When things are torn apart, then you can build something up, but we have to kind of, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I think every revolutionary process is an educational process. I think education is the key to all of this. And here I'm not just talking about education in a classroom or getting a master's degree or a PhD. I think all of these experiences that people had in Lower East Side, for example, were very educational. You learn through action. I think, the first step is that we have to wake people up. We have to make them aware of just how severe the crisis is. Everything may look pretty good right now. And granted, here in Scandinavia, compared to the US, things are pretty good. You're way ahead of us on so many levels. I can't begin to tell you. I come from a very stupid country. Not that the people are stupid, but that the direction that the society has chosen to go is stupid. At any rate, so I think, you have to raise awareness, you have to raise consciousness, and you need to educate people. And then when people are educated, they'll feel more motivated to act. And it's true, people are busy. And not everyone is going to undertake sweat equity urban homesteading. Not everyone is going to want to be arrested at a climate march, trying to shut down Wall Street. But I believe that the problems that we face exist on so many levels that there are many, many points of entry. That, if you're an architect, for example, there's a lot that you could do. If you were to take your knowledge and skills and talents and apply them in an arena like this. We worked with architects there. They played an important role. If you are a student or a housewife, there are things that you can do as well. And not just on the level of individual, recycling and composting, which, as I said, is very important, but also to begin to ratchet up your level of involvement and activity. And that's really what we need to do, I think, is educate people in whatever way we can and encourage them to act in creative and constructive ways. No easy answers to any of it, though. I mean, obviously, we're talking about a massive project. But it has to begin somewhere, and I think the place it begins is where we live, with our friends and with our neighbors. And then we can build out from there.
Yes.
Sweat equity, how do you have rules for that too? That if you do this, you can stay for a week, or how?
Oh, how does the sweat equity work? Yeah, everyone is expected to volunteer labor even after the building is completed. People own their own apartments, but then to maintain the building, everyone contributes, depends building to building, 4 hours a week, 2 hours a week, 8 hours a week labor to maintain things, keep it going. Yeah. And the other rule is that in order that, people own their individual apartments, they're co-ops. You can sell your apartment, but you can only sell it for what you've put into it. So it's taken out of the profit motive is taken out of it.
But how much you pay for? Oh, you mean in money then?
No, money and labor,
Yeah,
both.
But how much is an hour? How do you?
Minimum wage,
Minimum.
which in the U.S. at that time was about $2 an
So
hour.
that was written into the contract?
Yeah, it was understood. It was written in. There were covenants so that the building would always remain housing for low-income people. You also had to meet an income. You couldn't make more than a certain amount of money, a very small amount of money, in fact. Yes?
We earlier spoke about your hometown.
Yeah.
You keep saying we, and I'm confused. Who's we? I mean, is there any group?
Well, we as the town as a whole, because we make decisions together. The Energy Committee I was talking about, there are, I think, well, we actually have 2 towns that are meeting together now. But there are about 12 people on that committee.
And you are elected?
No, we're
Yes,
volunteers. We're appointed by the select board. We do have elected offices in town. We have the select board, which is elected, and they administer the town between town meetings, carry out the decisions made at the town meeting. We have an elected school board also, which I was elected to once. But other than that, they're volunteer boards.
Maybe I could just add in something here, because I think there is it's a little bit lack of history teaching in Swedish schools. These traditions with a very participatory form of local government, we have had them here in Sweden too, and up till quite recently. But in the 50s and in the 70s, we had very large municipal reforms, essentially centralizing the municipalities a lot. In the countryside, the traditions, which you refer to, have been carried on into other organizations, like the cooperative movements that always, or local businesses in the countryside. Even we can think about the problems of the countryside today, but that kind of ethos or
Sure.
like cooperative spirit has been here too. And at the municipal government, the praxis, these kind of meetings, town meetings, we had them when there were before these municipal reforms, 50s and 70s. If you look in the countryside, directly after the what is it in English? Allmän rösträtt, suffrage.
Yeah, women's vote.
In many rural municipalities, we had the same kind of meetings and the same kind of boards. Of course, it was in the 20s, so they had all the problems that society had in the 20s. It was not like equal and so on, but they existed. So it's just to add in a small piece of history.
It goes back to the Vikings.
Yes, the team tradition. Yes.
Yeah, I wonder how was it financed? Like you said, you had offices and
Yeah.
like how was the economy run?
Well, people were part of the larger economic system, of course, but they created many cooperatives, producers' cooperatives, making the window box greenhouses, the domes, the solar installation collective, the carpentry collective. They created also consumers' co-ops. They had a fuel oil co-op so that the buildings, the sweat equity buildings, could buy in bulk and get their fuel oil for less money. They had a food co-op. They created a community credit union, which, since the banks had redlined, would not extend credit in the neighborhood. Turns out, even in a poor community like that, there are millions of dollars that flow through the community, but it flowed out of the community. So they tried to create a mechanism that allowed it to serve as a resource for the community. So the community credit union could lend money to different individuals or products. They also looked outside for some assistance. You know, the initial sweat equity building, they were able to purchase the building for very little money, but then they still needed to buy materials for construction. And they looked around and they found a small dairy cooperative in upstate New York run by a couple of 80-year-old socialists who said, we'll give you a no-interest loan for $100,000, which they did. And then gradually people were able to pay off the loan. Then they were able to bring enough political pressure to bear on the city through politics, and also because, in fact, the sweat equity process produced high-quality housing for low-income people at about 1/4 of what it cost the state to build their projects or the federal government. So it was very attractive, so the city established a small fund to lend money to the sweat equity cooperatives also.
I have 3 people on the list, and I just wonder how sharp the time is. Will the alarm go?
It's pretty sharp.
But
I'm
wait.
sorry, I went on too
Let
long.
us just these 3 questions. So we can just, if anybody have to go and want to write their name on this list, do it if you haven't written. But I think we take all the question in one go. Okay?
I was just wondering, in this type of direct democracy, how do you make sure that everybody's voice are heard, not only the ones that volunteer to speak their mind?
Yeah.
Because there are many groups of society that maybe don't have such a strong voice.
Sure.
Good question.
Good question.
And then you.
I passed my question.
You pass your question.
I rather had a comment, but I think that is in Swedish cities it doesn't exist any empty houses where the words fill, and they're usually quite.
Yeah.
There are some empty houses. What are you talking about? I can point them out for you.
Okay, but there are very few, I would say. Yeah, okay, but maybe.
Okay, but
Yeah.
I can
Yeah,
point them
but-
out.
Okay.
It's true. It's
It's
much less than in the
Much
60s
less.
and 70s, and
Yeah, but
then
I
we
also
had a
think,
lot.
in the 70s was a lot. And that was, I think, I mean, we doesn't have any, nowadays, we doesn't have any, like, this town hall, the direct democracy in Sweden. So I think to start that one, I think is really hard.
Yeah,
It is hard. It's all hard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we have to do it.
You want to address
alternative?
that
Yes, I
question?
do. Very important question. First of all, I'd say that this was a community that had many people silenced. It's a minority community, and they were really discriminated against and oppressed in many ways. But even within that community, for example, traditionally in Hispanic culture, women have a subservient role, and young people are supposed to be seen but not heard. So the movement that I worked with took a very conscious stance that we want to hear all voices. So they gave women positions of leadership. They encouraged women to take positions of leadership, and they encouraged women to become involved in all aspects of the process. Women were there banging nails along with the men. They were laying brick. They were putting in plumbing. They were doing all of the same work. And they involved young people through a system that they called a shadow system. The idea, each one teach one, so that a leader like Chino, for example, would take on a young person as an apprentice. And a young person would follow him around and go to meetings and learn the skills that Chino had to teach him. So it was an educational process and a very self-conscious attempt to make sure that all voices were heard. Clearly not all voices were heard, but they made the effort, and they had actual techniques that they used to encourage that.
But like in Vermont, where you have the volunteer
Yeah.
citizen councils,
Yeah.
how do you carry out the interests of other groups?
Well, we are accountable to the town meeting,
Yeah.
each of the committees.
Yeah.
So, and not everyone participates in the town meetings, but that's their choice.
Yeah.
They have that opportunity. We encourage them. We try to make it easy for them, but some are interested, some aren't.
I think we have to say good night.